Hello and welcome to day 12 of my vlogmas. Today, on this last day of the year, I'm going to give you my stats for the entire year. In previous years, I've done this quarterly as well as the yearly wrap-up. I've not been great about my reading and about my channel this year, so this is going to be just the yearly wrap-up, that is. If you saw my goals video, you'll know moving forward, my goal is to do this every 6 months. I'd like to do quarterly reviews, but not stats. I recognize stats can be a lot, and I don't think they're necessarily as informative when it comes to short-term perspectives. I think it tells us more about my reading habits and how they're evolving year to year, more so than that quarterly way. I also think it might be less overwhelming to the viewers. So I've kept that in mind in how I've shaped my stats video here. Not just the fact that I'm making fewer of them, but I think I'm getting a little bit less in the weeds than I have in previous years. So if you're a returning viewer, hopefully you'll appreciate what I'm showing you while also feeling a little bit less, overwhelmed by all the pictures and numbers. All right then, let's get into this. Let's start with just some general numbers. The number of books that I read this year is a clean 100. That was my goal. I did not think I was going to meet it, but generally it's been a great month because I managed to get caught up. It's probably because I've had 2 weeks off from work, and so I've been doing a lot of biking, a lot of listening to audio books while I do that is. And so it's been a good month. I will be honest and say I've got one book left to finish, but I'm down to 56 minutes on that. And while my time at 6:50 p.m. here, I'm confident I'm going to finish that. I'm pretty sure I know what my review is. As a whole, I read 100 books. That's the takeaway. How that compares to my previous years here on BookTube, well, we have 120 in last year, 2021, and then 207 my first year. I knew in 2021 that it wasn't sustainable to keep doing 200. It was just, one, the pandemic meant that I had more time to myself, but also I had reshaped how I lived my life to where I was doing much less TV, much less podcasting. And those are two things that I really do enjoy. I know it may seem trivial, especially the TV part, but I like to find a balance of things that I love. And that's what I've been trying to do here on BookTube. I have been overwhelmed still with school and work this year, hence my number being just 100, which isn't obviously a bad thing. It's amazing. When I get to my month-to-month numbers, of course, you'll see that there's been months of huge slogs. And that is, of course, because I've just been overwhelmed with work and school and finishing my PhD, right? It's not a bad thing. It's just life, right? But before we get to my month-to-month, let's talk about the total number of pages. This year, I read just under 32,000 pages. Compare that to last year, 2021, I read 40,000, and in 2020, I read 72,500 pages. So we're looking at more than less than half of what I read in 2020, which is perfectly fine. Like I said, it wasn't sustainable in 2020, but it's my lowest numbers. But what the real question will be whether or not the type of books I've been reading have evolved in a direction that is more in line with what I'm hoping to achieve in the type of books that I'm reading. I'll expand on that when I get to the diversity of the books that I read. First, let's look now at the month-to-month numbers here. So just quickly reviewing the number of books, you can see that I've managed to, for the first part of the year, to get about 10 books a month. This last month, I've gotten back up to over 15, and in between months of the last half of the year, I was barely getting 5, and some months just a couple. And again, that was largely because my PhD defense was in August, hence the August and July slog. September and October was pretty good. I was visiting my family. Then in November, I was traveling, and I guess I ended up not getting as many read as I would have liked. I would have thought that once I was isolated with myself, I would have read more, but I didn't. I think it's more interesting though to look at the page numbers. I like to see my pattern here and how the number of pages specifically that I'm reading, this is all translated, of course, from audiobooks for the most part, is about 4,000 on a good month. Like now in December, I've read 4,000 pages. That's in line with my best month this year, that is. So I'm not necessarily reading more than usual. It's more that I'm back on track to what I would consider my casual reading rate. I want to also go ahead and throw in this case, page numbers in 2000 and 2021 to give you a sense of what my average was then. You see my best month, obviously, I got between 5,000 and 6,000. That was December and January of 2021. But in the in-between months, it looks like it was always hovering near 4,000 as a healthy number to achieve. So I think moving forward, barring any major life setbacks, I think this next year I'll probably achieve between 3,500 and 4,000 pages a month. I haven't done the math to see how many books that is. I'm still aiming for 100 books this next year. But what I do like about these 2 different years is I think we have enough data points to be able to see, I guess, what a stable reading rate is when I'm reading, but also, living life, just doing other passions that I'm interested in, not just TV and podcasts. Those are just 2 big things I do on my own. But, I like family, I like friends. I believe 3,500 to 4,000 looks to be about what I would consider, I guess, my average reading rate on a normal month, I suppose. Now, thinking about the number of pages, the average number of pages was 319. That's down from 339 last year and 342 in 2020. This graph you're looking at, I'm not going to compare it to the last year's because they're pretty much on point. My number of books have decreased, but also my average page length has decreased. And I think really the reason for that is that I've read fewer long books. I don't want to say it's like a major goal, because I already did my goals video to read longer books, but I think because I've been so overwhelmed with life, I've just been a little slow to pick up longer books that I think might be a little bit challenging. And I would like to push myself to try longer books, especially since my goal of 100 is easily achievable, at least at the rate that I expect to be reading, meaning that I can afford spending extra time on one book here and there to get my page numbers up, because I would like to see that average increase, just as a personal goal, rather than seeing myself sort of pulling towards shorter books. Okay, and looking at publishing years, my publishing years was not as great as it was in the past. That most of my books were after 1920s and onward. The one book being from 1800s, and that of course was probably Charles Dickens's Christmas Carol. Doesn't really count. Most of my books are being read in the 2000s and onwards. That's made more evident by the averages here. Well, for this year, 2009 compared to 1988 and 2021, and even 2002 in the year 2020. Now, that's the general gist of the publication years of what I've been reading. As far as ratings go, my average isn't very different from previous years. I think it's like 4.05 or 4.08. What's interesting is I've definitely increased in the overall 5 to 4.5 ratings. I don't know what that is, means I have a lot more favorites, a lot more books that I'm loving, which I guess makes sense. Like, I'm reading fewer books, which means the books I am reading, more of them are books that I know I'm going to like, whether they be rereads or just me playing it safe with the books I pick up, which it has some good and some bad. It's good that I'm reading good books, but it's not as good that I'm not pushing myself to venture out into the waters a bit to dip my toes in some more challenging books. Now, jumping over to the genres that I read, which I think is the most exciting part of the actual book statistics personally. This is the plot. Like year to year, but even quarter to quarter, they just don't change that much. I love fantasy, I love horror, and I love sci-fi. Those will always be the majority of what I read. If anything, we definitely have a solid 2/3 being those 3 things. What's new here is I think my largest genre is horror, and I don't have a problem with that. I actually am really glad to see myself picking up more horror. A solid third is in the horror to mystery genre. I guess I should note that I've color-coded my genres here. Like, I consider mystery thriller tangent to horror, ergo it is pink next to horror's red. And then when it comes to historical, classic, and contemporary, those are all different shades of green, and nonfiction being different shades of orange/yellow. Interestingly, I've read more politics and history this year, but in previous years it seems like memoirs were always the big number, but I seem to be picking, when it comes to nonfiction, more towards history and politics, which I don't know what that means. I don't know what that's telling me, honestly. One thing I will note here is my historical and literary works. When we talk about me playing it safe, historical and literary works that are usually the ones that are hardest for me to get into. So it makes sense that those are next to non-existent in this graph. Now, let's take a different look at this. This is a graph I made last year where I'm considering all the subgenres. Basically, I've gone through, I've listed the main genre of every book, but because we know so many books are a mishmash of genres, I basically give myself up to 4 subgenres to label a book. Meaning it may be a horror book, it may be a fantasy book, but if it has any categorization of literary or historical or horror, I will add that on there. And then basically I just sum all those subgenres up to give you a total number of books that fit into that. So as per usual, the most here are still sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, which is to be expected. It makes sense also that fantasy is the largest because when it comes to horror, I do prefer fantasy horror. I love the paranormal and the supernatural, and I categorize that as a fantasy. It makes sense that it will dominate here, even though horror is the objectively highest number of genre I've read. But if we look then at literary and historical, we can begin to see, even romance honestly, begin to see there's a lot more. Even here, classics, 14 versus 8. So big picture, I really like this graph. I think it's actually more informative than the pie chart graph because it gives a more holistic view of all the type of books that I'm reading. And it also shows how I think we as readers can sort of venture out into things we're not as comfortable with. Meaning if I want to try to read more books in genres that I'm not as comfortable with, naturally I should just find books that explore that genre with a genre that I know I'm going to like. That's my recommendation to you. That's how I approach it. That's usually how I try to read more genres, rather than trying to restrict myself to just affirm I need to read these genres. If I can find books that explore multiple genres, all the better. Now, before I reflect on the diversity of the books that I read, I want to take a quick second to review where my books are coming from. We have the rereads, we have the TBR shelf, we have books that are arcs or reviews, then we have books that are other. These are generally books that I either bought on Audible without holding it on physical copy, or I listen to it through my library, something like that, or through Scribd. Moving forward, I will keep showing these graphs, but I would take it with a grain of caution because I don't have my TBR with me. I have like 20 books. You probably can't see them. Most of the books are back home. Even outside of those books, though, when I moved here, I got rid of a shit ton, and I haven't had a chance to update that list on what's there. So as I move forward, I'm going to continue labeling something as on my TBR or not, but it's going to be off memory of what I remember, and it may or may not actually still be on there. With that said, I guess I'll also note that in the past years, I've fixated a lot on my TBR, and I've gotten to the point where I'm not as concerned. And of course, part of that is I don't actually have the TBR with me. For example, here, I think my other category is probably a fraction larger than past year. It's substantially larger because last year I fixated almost entirely on my TBR or ARC. Those are the rules I have for myself in 2021. I haven't been as strict in 2022. I was already going through a slog, so why would I punish myself? But moving forward, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to read books I want to read for the reasons that I want to read them. If I end up not reading my TBR shelf, well then I guess that's a book I shouldn't keep. It's easy to say that when the book's aren't around me. But for now, that's how I'm approaching this. Real quick, let's also compare this month to month. I think you can see that September was when I was realizing, okay, I'm not in Canada anymore. My books are gone. I mean, the books were there. They're just in boxes around me at this point. So naturally, I started reading more of the other category. Books that weren't on my TBR, I stopped carrying as much. But also, after dipping down in July and August, I just felt like I need to read more. I need to stop setting these rules up for myself that make it harder for me to want to read and just let myself breathe. And interestingly enough, I think you can see that especially for September and October, I don't think my numbers would have been much higher than July and August. I hadn't have done that. Now here in December, you can see just a substantial increase of books across the board. Generally speaking, I think there's a lot of rereads in December for me. It's a comfort month. Now let's talk about the diversity. This is, I guess, the part where I need to be reflective on what I'm reading, whether or not I'm achieving what I want to achieve out of what I'm reading. I'm reading with purpose, as in Jerry Vermonik's pages says. Let's start with gender. I won't be showing as many graphs here first because I realize I can skip you numbers. I'm read 44% male and 43% cis females. That is cis male and cis female. That's actually the first time that those two numbers have basically been equal. It's also the first time that I've technically read more men than women since I've taught about my booktube channel. That is to say cis men than cis women. If you include trans women, I'm not sure the numbers would be. I didn't do that because the other option here would be my trans or non-binary authors, which is still a category that I keep to itself. This year I read 13% authors who were trans and were non-binary, which of course is the same as being trans. But in past years, I did 8%, and then before that, barely 3%, not even 3%. So I am seeing in this field, even though I've not read as much, I'm seeing substantial increases in the diversity of genders or gender non-conforming authors, and I'm very happy to see that. I won't set like a firm goal for myself. I would love to see this number maintained, if not increased. That's, I guess, the ultimate goal is to maintain and or increase. As far as white authors, I've read 59%. That's about on par with past years, which was 57 and 60%. In past years, I've dissected the race of the authors that I've read. I'm still tracking those numbers for now, but I'm not gonna delve into that because I've learned that it's impossible to get myself to read every possible race that exists in the world. Two, I just don't think there's a way to think about that or to talk about it that it doesn't feel very, I don't know, like reading them for the sake of their race. Like my goal is to read a variety of experiences, a variety of perspectives, and to read fewer white perspectives. So as I move forward, my goal is probably to read 50% or more people of color. And as I do that, I will continue to consider the type of authors that I'm reading to see whether or not I am continuing to push myself to explore authors from different parts of the world that or different perspectives that I don't traditionally go to. And I guess that's the level of depth I'm going to go into that moving forward. Now, considering queer authors, unfortunately, while my number of genderqueer authors have increased, the number of queer authors really hasn't. We're going from 28% last year to 29%, which is still better than 21% in 2020. And then dissecting the queer people of color specifically, because I think it's also important to think about the intersectional nature of who we're reading, and that is 48%, which is only up by 1% from last year, but it's still up, I think, 13% from 2020. In general, I'm glad that I'm thinking about it, but I'm not sure I'm making much progress there, meaning since even though I was still thinking about this after 2021, which is when I first started thinking about it, I don't seem to be improving it. So I need to, I guess, be more conscious of that. And one way I want to be doing that is if you saw my goal video this year, my goal that focused on variety of perspectives and diversity really was as simple as read, I think it was a third of authors who have intersectional identities, whether they be queer or a person of color or disabled or something of that nature, some combination of perspectives. Obviously, again, it's not about figuring out that I read every possible perspective out there. It's just more to encourage myself to think about whether or not the book I'm picking up is introducing me to a new window of perspective. Does that make sense? My goal is to just push myself to ask that question. What is this book getting me? What am I getting out of this book? And I know it's a complicated question to say what book should you read and why, but I also think that there are so many books in the world, plenty of which are fascinating and interesting. The ultimate reason we pick them up, I think, matters. I think it matters. And I don't think it's as simple as trying to ignore the fact that there were going to be clear biases. Like I, as a white masculine person, read almost entirely white men before I realized that I was reading nothing but men, right? So it's one of those things where it's not as if we're not already thinking about things like race or gender or queerness. We just don't realize how we're thinking about it. Does that make sense? I hope it does. I feel like if you're this far in the video, you're probably sort of in sync with me here. I think that's everything. Okay, so I guess we can talk about favorites. No, it's not. This isn't a favorites video. This is a stats video, and I've pretty much given you everything I think I have to give. It's good. I like this video. I mean, I don't know how it's going to come together, but what I do like is I feel like I've focused on points that matter without getting too deep in the details. I have a habit, like I said at the beginning of the video, of getting as much information on something as possible, and I recognize that it's overwhelming and not as useful to you if I don't sort of filter it down to get to the brass tacks. Big picture though, this is the end of the year, last video of the year. If you're watching this, if you made it to the end, I appreciate you. I appreciate you. That's what I appreciate about you. Thank you so much. You are the best, and I'm really glad and appreciative of your time. I've been making these now for almost a week, 2 weeks, I mean. But it's been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed talking about the books that I've read, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing about them. Let me know how your reading year has been and what your goals are moving forward. But as always, I hope you all stay safe, and I'll see you all tomorrow for my final 13 days of Vlogmas, aka 13 days of Josh, for my January TBR. Goodbye.